if people go around with the idea that the only people who lived in the 18th century were John Adams and Benjamin Franklin and George Washington, and I guarantee, like most people do, like that's, we just kind of carry these cartoon characters around in our head. I really wanted to tell her story as a way to ask us to think about how history is written, and what gets saved and what gets lost and what gets remembered and what gets forgotten, and what the consequences are of each of those choices. So Franklin's story is about that too. Franklin writes an autobiography in which he leaves Jane out, this person who was incredibly important to him, a person whom he wrote more letters than he wrote to anyone else. He never mentions her name when he tells the story of his life, because he has altered the historical record. He's crafting a story about himself that's about himself and about anybody who's worthwhile, someone who's unencumbered and who can pursue their own individual liberty and freedom and cast off the bonds of tyranny. And her story is not that. Her story is about taking care of, her children, her grandchildren, her great-grandchildren, taking care of anybody but herself. And that, we kind of need that peace. I abandoned the project for two reasons. One, because the sources were so scant, but two, the story was really quite sad. And so narratively, it seemed to me a real challenge. Like if you think about like an XY axis, and you have like birth over here and death over here on the X, so kind of moving through time chronologically on the X axis. And like on your Y axis is like happiness, prosperity, whatever. And you have Jane and Benjamin, they start down here. And then like Franklin's life is just like a straight rise. His world gets bigger, he gets wealthier, love and success, wonder, And Jane's is sort of like this. And so I started with the beginning of their lives, and I got like, I can't really do this and be in your, I got like to here. And I realized it's like Prince and the Pauper or Tale of Two Cities. And now, narratively, we need them to switch places. Like, the reader just wants them to switch places. And I was like, they're not. And so I just quit. Like, I thought, I don't know how to satisfy the reader that needs the story to go in another direction. Because it's going nowhere. Narratively, it was really hard to contend with. So when I came back to it, I actually quite differently reimagined the project. Now actually begins 2 centuries before Jane's born and ends, like a century or 2 centuries later. Like I could have stretched out the x-axis and tried to put and then what happens is different. The whole curve looks differently. And also then it makes the broader claim about the writing of history. She really felt strongly from when I was a very little kid that she sort of wanted me to go out in the world and do things that she hadn't been able to do. She didn't want me to be constrained in the ways she had been constrained. And it's almost like she made a project of stripping me of all my natural instincts, which are, I'm an incredible homebody. Like I just like to be home. I like to be home with my kids. I like to just sit and read a book. Like she just forever kicked me out of the house. You must go do this. You have to try that now. You have to do this. And I didn't want to go to college. She's like, you must go to college. And when I told her years ago about Jane Franklin, like, isn't this cool? Did you ever know Benjamin Franklin had a sister? And we had grown up on Franklin Street, so a lot of Franklin stuff in our house. And she was like, you must write that book. Like, that's so important. People need to know that. And I was like, I couldn't possibly write that book. That would be an impossible. Think about that. There's it's a one-sided correspondence for 30 years. Like, what do you do? How can you write about the person who only received letters? Like, you just can't do that. She's like, oh, you can figure it out. So I put everything aside, or as much as aside that I could, and I worked really hard to finish the book, but not in time because my mother died within the year. But I do think of the book as a monument to my mother. You have to kind of get in touch with the part of you that lives in agony to write a book about someone who suffers so much. Or else you're going to trivialize it. Or it's going to become, that's what cheap sentimentalism is, right? Like it's someone who actually doesn't understand sorrow. So I had to go really spend time with that. And what the reader response to that New York Times op-ed taught me was actually the sorrow is the story. Like the thing that I found so hard about, the XY axis, that was okay. That's actually what people needed, was to know that this is, and so to dive down to the bottom of that instead of keep trying to float to the top of it was hard to do, especially because a lot of her sorrow was about the loss of her children. I have little kids at home, and just snuggling with them in bed in the morning and thinking about what it is to lose somebody. It's almost like you shouldn't think about such a thing. But I've heard from a lot of readers who, in fact, readers who've lost children, who are grateful for that being a story told here. There's the various founding fathers lost children. We hear about it in a line or a footnote in these, crazy Father's Day doorstop biographies that just the domestic sorrow is not part of the plot. As if it didn't fell people to lose someone in the 18th century. Of course, it just felled them. But it's not the story that we want to tell about George Washington, So it felt important to tell a story that understood and makes space on the page for the profundity of grief. Well, I like the idea that a life that was just a good life is worth writing. It's not great. She didn't accomplish some great triumph. She's not Benjamin Franklin. We have biographies of people who did terrible, terrible things, and we have biographies of people who changed the world. I like just the story of a good person struggling with the everyday, ordinary chaos of living a life and doing well in the world. And I also love for Jane, Franklin always published as a young man these essays under the pseudonym Silence Do Good, which was his, but the best way to live a good life is to silently do good. And that's Jane.